Well, thank you to everyone for coming, for the small but mighty crowd. Um, so we have 40 minutes. I have a lot of information. So I just want to say that my plan is to do really high level as I go through it. And I'm happy to share the slides afterwards with all the references because I'm much more interested in having a high level information, but I wanted to make it available so that people could also do a deeper dive if they wanted to. I just want to start before I introduce myself or anything. For those of you that are not familiar, this is something that we often do in Canada, which is a land acknowledgement, and like to read a land acknowledgement to you. We acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Kanai Nation, also known as the Mohawk people. Now, Cahokia, now called Montreal, has long been a place of meeting and exchange amongst many Indigenous nations. Land acknowledgements are a way to recognize the enduring presence and right of Indigenous peoples and to reflect on the ongoing impacts of colonialism. They remind us that we all have a responsibility to learn, unlearn, and act. As people living on this land, we are all treaty people, whether our ancestors arrived here by choice, by force, or were here since time immemorial. This land acknowledgement is an acknowledgement and a step towards truth and respect, a meaningful reconciliation. If anyone is interested in Canada, we have something called the Truth and Reconciliation Report that was created with many recommendations on behalf of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and one of them is a request to do land acknowledgements. So I'm going to just start talking about Sagesse, which is who I'm with. If you are from Quebec, it is Sagesse. And it is an organization that empowers people, organizations, and communities to break the cycle of domestic abuse. We also work around coercive control, sexual exploitation. This is me. I have been with CGS for 20 plus years, mostly in domestic abuse prevention. We have recently expanded our context to be around coercive control generally. We're an innovative organization in Alberta, Canada, and we've recently also expanded to Saskatchewan, which is now where I live part-time. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Salford in applied psychology with Rod and Linda Deborah Marshall. I'm a registered social worker. I've also published a few things, and I recently wrote a book about innovation, which was a lot of fun because it is sort of like a choose your own adventure innovation book. Because I just want to start by just defining what I'm talking about when I say coercive control. So I see coercive control as an act or a pattern of acts that are used to regulate or dominate another person's life and remove personal agency. And so the pictures that are up here, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Jenga game where you take a block from the bottom and you put it on top and you never know exactly when it's going to topple and you're never sure what block is going to bring it all down. That is somewhat the experience of coercive control. And also there's a bird cage up there, and part of what we talk about is this cage that you're in that sometimes is an invisible cage. Even if the door gets opened, you're still in it, and why doesn't the bird fly out? It creates invisible chains and a sense of fear that pervades every part of one's life. And I like to think about coercive control as a human rights issue because it limits human rights by depriving individuals of their liberty. So I talk about it just in terms of it being low level and sometimes not injurious, right? It's not about a black eye and a broken bone. It's often cumulative and it's frequent, not episodic. The reason that I talk about it this way is often people think that there's a violent episode cycle, right? And that is not the case at all when it comes to coercive control, which is why it is a much better framework, in my opinion, for describing the cycle of abuse. And I don't just mean domestic abuse, I mean just generally the cycle of the experience, because it's not a cycle, it's a pattern. So how do people talk about their experiences of coercive control? So when people talk about them, you might hear about a real weaponization of vulnerability, right? People, we work a lot with the 2S LGBTQ communities. People fear being outed, having their intimate securities used against them, people being purposefully or publicly humiliated, forced to make decisions that are not in their own best interest. And, the themes are shame, sabotage, uncertainty, and intentional patterns. I'm going through this really quick because this is not the part that I want to focus on. So, my email is at the end. I'm happy to send out the slides. Don't worry about madly taking notes unless you want to. So these are some of the common impacts of coercive control. There is a long reference list at the end of these slides. All of these impacts come from those works, but This is nothing new, I think, to anybody in this room. We all know that these are the impacts. So this is really what I want to talk about, which is peer-based group support for survivors of coercive control. So as part of my PhD research, I've been interviewing both professionals who are in the field, who are working cross-contextually in coercive control. And by professionals, I don't just mean therapists or social workers. I've also interviewed doctors, lawyers, faith leaders, because they are part also of who are offering these supports and services. And have also interviewed survivors. And so this information comes both partly from my interviews as well as from the research. So we know that peer support groups offer this experience of shared validation and a shared experience. And so they allow survivors to connect with each other, people who have had similar experiences. There's this opportunity to reclaim identity. So one of the things that we know happens to people is that their identity gets colonized by the abusive experiences. And so part of what it allows is one to reclaim their identity through the process of the group. There's lots of evidence of efficacy of peer support groups in cases of coercive control. And it's in examples of cultic experiences, domestic abuse, sexual exploitation. So it's not just in one area. In particular, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I recently published an article with some colleagues we did a very lengthy study on the effects of our intervention, which was peer-based groups, and their cortisol levels, perceived stress, and ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so one of the things that we found is that peer support groups, there's significant reductions, or our peer support groups, and I think you can extrapolate it, that there are significant reductions in perceived stress, there were significant reductions in their cortisol levels, and there was improvements in safety-related empowerment, as well as supportive alliances with group members and the facilitators. I have a feeling hopefully I will make an application to present on that next year. It's just it wasn't ready when we were making the application. But I actually think it's a very unique study because we actually have never done anything like that before, and have never seen anything done where it's not just self-reported experiences, it's measuring cortisol levels. And I don't know how much people know about cortisol, but cortisol contributes to pretty much all parts of your well-being, not just your mental health well-being, but diabetes, obesity, heart attacks, like all of those things. And they're very flexible and integrative. And so this is part of what I want to focus on, which is you can actually integrate or complement almost any modality into a peer support group and have success, but you have to be flexible and adaptive in it. So I just want to see what I mean when I say peer support, right? And so when I say peer support, I think it can take many different forms. It can be therapist-led or practitioner-led. It can be peer-led with clinical supports. I think that no matter what, that there always needs to be a clinical support backing it up. They can be closed or open groups. They can have any duration, but what the research says is that the ideal duration is 16 to 20 weeks, but the average engagement is 6 to 7 weeks. So I think that we have to keep that in mind when there's the ideal, but also the average client duration. Part of how we've solved that problem in our agency is we do it in different chunks, right? So we do closed groups, but they're closed groups of register for 6, and then register for the next 6, and register for the next 6, because often that actually helps with engagement and compliance to engagement, because it doesn't feel like, oh my God, I'm registering for a 16-week group or a 20-week group. I also think it's really important that peer support groups have to have clarity about the content and the outcomes. This is not like, come into a room, let me put on a tea, and everybody just talk about whatever you want to talk about. There has to be focus and goals and outcomes. So I want to talk about some of the complementary approaches. I'm not going to go into too much detail about each of them, but I want to just talk high level. So one of the first complementary approaches that we use, and I've researched, and I know that some of you use as well in your groups, is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And so some of the things that we know is that CBT approaches increase the person's ability to process information successfully, which supports and enhances self-efficacy, which we know so often is impacted by the experiences of coercive control, as well as giving a sense of hope for the future, which we also know often doesn't exist. There was a 2013 meta-analysis of CBT in all of its forms, and it was found to be effective in treating a variety of the type of mental health conditions that arise from coercive control, PTSD, depression, anxiety, sleep disturbances, grief and loss, and generalized stress. But do I think that CBT alone is going to do it? Possibly not. It is one tool in the toolbox. So these are all the types of CBT that are out there, and this is in no way, shape, or form an exhaustive list, right? There's even more. I think that what's particularly important and interesting to note is that it has been proven as a good mechanism and a good approach, and that these approaches have been found to be effective across all of the contexts that coercive control shows up. Domestic abuse, sexual exploitation, child abuse, high coercion groups, all of those things. So another one of the complementary tools that can be used in a peer-based group is attachment approaches. I think it's really interesting because attachment approaches are not just about the individual's attachment perhaps to the facilitator or the individual's attachment to the peer facilitator, the therapist, right? Because often in that therapeutic relationship, attachment wounds start to get healed, but they start to get healed because of the group that exists. Recently, I had a really interesting conversation with someone about why, and this is a very big generalization. We're going to do some research on it. We actually just got a grant. We have found that, so we deal with both male victims and female victims, and we also deal with perpetrators as well. And one of the things that we have found with the men that we work with is that they seem to present with more attachment wounds than women present with. It's just a presentation. This is just a narrative. I will tell you next year if we are right and it is correct. But we've been trying to figure out what is our theory behind it, because we have to make a research question, right? And one of the things that we've noted is that women have a tendency, when given the opportunities, and there's not coercive control and all of those things, but women have a tendency to create their own groups. And when they create their own groups, they start to heal their own attachment wounds, whereas men societally are not given those same opportunities. And so we think that we're onto something. We're not sure. We're going to do a bit of research about it. We actually think we're going to focus on perpetrators in particular in this work, and it's going to be about perpetrators and natural supports. But I think that attachment is actually much bigger than we think it is, and that there's much more natural attachment healings that happened when people are given societal opportunities to engage in them. So, I think what is most telling about attachment is not running away from something. Attachment is running towards a source of safety, right? And I think that that's what we often forget about when we think about attachment. And we know that disorganized attachment leads to all sorts of disassociation and paracognitive and all of that. And so the bottom line is that practitioners observe that attachment injuries increase vulnerability to coercively controlling relationships. So I'm going to talk a lot about ideological approaches because I think that, and yesterday I went to a presentation by the psychiatrist whose name I totally forget, but Cyrus, who talked about how we have these pillars and we forget about faith. So I don't call it faith, I call it the ideological pillar, which is the pillar of meaning making. And so I think that often we forget about that there is this, existential and spiritual trauma that happens when one is in a coercively controlling situation. And I think particularly if you look at some people who get involved in cultic environments, they're looking for meaning, right? And so to remove that, right, can create an existential trauma. The other thing we know is that events of violence against a person as they destroy their identity or compromise their identity often make them feel an existential trauma around their humanity, right? And then there's also, though, I work a lot. I used to work, not so much, but I used to work for Jewish Family Services, and I worked with a lot of Jewish women who would say, who are abused, the abuse made me feel like I wasn't Jewish anymore, right? It made me feel like, how could a Jewish man do that to me? And that's not a unique experience. That is, right? So I think that there's these ideological experiences that a person has, or these meaning making that they really struggle with. And so I sort of like this idea of, the search for the sacred, because I think that that's what we're doing, but I don't think we're doing it from a faith-based perspective. I think we're doing it from a meaning-making perspective. So One of the things that kept bubbling up when I was talking to service providers, as well as to individuals, and also in my own practice of the work that I've done over the past 20 years, is that when coercive control disrupts core beliefs, identity, and connection to the sacred. And it can often lead to a spiritual disorientation, a loss of meaning, and an identity fragmentation, which are all very real psychological experiences. And I think that sometimes we ignore them because they are too faith-based, and it's not about faith. I think that healing must address both psychological and existential wounds, and that restoring spiritual agency, meaning making, and connection is essential for holistic recovery. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but there are many complementary ideological approaches and ideological tools out there. Rod and Linda have uh, created an ideological model to a totalistic identity theory. Rod would say it's not a framework. I would say it is. Him and I have had a conversation about it. He's like, it's a theorem. I'm like, it's a framework. But it doesn't really matter because it's a way to explain something and address it. I'm going to talk more about Clark, so I'm not going to talk about her phenomenological and reflective inquiry. There's, I think, an epistemological humility that you have to come to things with. Roddy and Gabrielle have a competency framework around it. There's the power threat meaning framework, which is not, it's why you resisted or your reactions to the things that happened. So there's all of these different tools, and this is by no means extensive. These are the tools that I use, and these are the tools that when I was talking with practitioners and interviewing them, the tools that I would say most got mentioned. But I don't think that like I have the secret sauce. I just think I have one example of a secret sauce that works in my practice and has worked in some of the research that I've done. So the first tool that I want to talk about is the listening for meaning tool, which is actually the co-creating space tool. It was created by a professor at the University of Windsor called Janet Clark. And essentially, it's an in-depth reflective inquiry in regards to understanding the meaning and the sources of meaning that clients use to interpret reality. And so it is an integrative model for spiritual and cultural sensitive practices, right? It really allows for the practitioner and the client, or the practitioner and the group, to co-create space to support the development of self-efficacy and develop supportive relationships. I work in an agency called Suggest, as I told you, and my staff roll their eyes at me regularly because I cannot tell you how many times a day I say reflective, humble inquiry, because I think that that is actually the cornerstone of this kind of work. And I think that all of these four ingredients, reflective, humble inquiry, creative, adaptive improvising, implementing dialogue enhancing practices, and interpretive and inductive collaboration, all have a co-creation of space. And especially when you're in a group environment, what you're trying to do is co-create space. This is also another tool, and this is a tool that I use because I work in a system in which faith has been made like enemy number one, right? I'm a social worker. Social workers especially, I think, often see faith as a damaging thing and they don't see the positives of it. As a result, I think we often forget to ask our clients about that part of their life. And so this, I think, is probably more like in a nonprofit environment where you have all these like rules and regulations around you, is more of like a tool perhaps for that than a private practitioner who has more freedom and how they can talk about things. But this is very helpful for us, and we use it because it makes sure that regardless of the personal beliefs or the training of the person coming in, they recognize that part of the questions they have to ask, right? Just in the same way that we ask about what are your natural supports, what kind of, mental health issues are you struggling with, what kind of medication are you on, right? What is your financial situation that you might need supports with, right? We ask a bunch of questions about that are super intrusive about other parts of your life. Why would we not ask these? I'm going to talk a little bit more about another tool that I use. That's a TTM tool, Transtheoretical Model tool, in which the person who uses the tool, who developed the tool, a guy named Scott Miller, talks about how at one point in his work, he got really, really, really stuck with a client, and it was because he was not addressing this part of their worldview. So there's lots of positive correlations between using these tools. I'm not going to go into it. I want to talk next about transtheoretical models and the value in addressing coercive control using those tools and in a group setting. So it really recognizes the readiness for change. And often when you're in a group, you have all sorts of people who are at different levels of readiness for change. And so this recognizes that that is part of the process. And I'm going to talk about Prochaska and DiClemente's stages of change, because that's the model that we use. And we help people identify where they might be in those stages of change. It really supports individual agency, which, as we know, is a big piece that's been taken away. It normalizes the process of change, which involves relapse, right? One of the things that we also do sometimes is we have groups that are for people who have comorbidities like addictions and domestic abuse, or addictions and sexual exploitation. And it has happened more than once that the group has relapsed together, right? And so part of that is also part of the risks of a peer-based group, right? But I think that part of what this does is it normalizes the process of change, and that relapse might happen either individually or as a group. It also allows the group to be great, to give grace to each other when relapse happens, right? Because I think sometimes in groups, especially when people have issue with the process that someone else is going on because it's triggering them, we've actually had this experience that people get super judgmental of each other, right? And so if we recognize that there's a process of change and relapse happens, that will often help the group to become more gentle and give more grace to each other. It guides tailored interventions and, again, applicable across all contexts. So we know that transtheoretical models are used widely in trauma recovery because they work. Part of what I also like about them is that the change follows a predictable stage process, that we know that real change occurs when the individual becomes an active agent in their own life, and of course, emphasizes self-efficacy and empowerment, and we know that it is very effective. So, like I said, lots of TTM models out there. There's no right or wrong model. This is the model that we use. It's Prochaska and DiClemente's model. It explains how people intentionally change behavior through a series of changes, and it recognizes, and I think that this is really important, that it's a process, not an event. And so I think that that just creates more grace and gentleness for individuals as they go through their journey. And also, I think has a tendency, when you talk about it in a group setting, to create more grace together, or more grace for each other. I'm not going to go through Prochaska and DiClemente's stages of change, but there's lots of research that talks about the value of it, and also the value of mapping it. On a totally different note, I'm just going to talk about the value of mapping it. And this is also me from a nonprofit perspective. We mapped our clients on to this process of change. Where are clients generally when they come in? Where are clients generally when they leave, whether they leave voluntarily or terminate themselves? How much does each process take a client cost to go through? Because there's a cost to it. And if someone comes in later or earlier, is there more or less cost to the system? And part of what we found is, of course, this is like a no-brainer, people who come in earlier stay longer and cost less to the system, right? So if someone comes in the contemplation stage into our programs, we generally, the return on investment is $47 for every person. So that means that we save the system of police visits, child welfare, homelessness, all of those things. We save the system $47 for every $1. On average, for the individual, we save the system $72,000. We did it with someone from the London School of Economics, right? So that's why it's so important, I think, to recognize it, because we used to get all the time, and the reason we did this is we get all the time people who call, I think I'm in an abusive relationship. I'm not sure. I think I might have been sexually assaulted, but I kind of consented, or I was like drunk, or right, like those sort of things. We also work with sex workers who are choice-based sex workers, but choice-based sex workers can find themselves often wandering in to coercive and exploitive experiences. But because they were choice-based, they would call and say, well, it was a John and he paid me, but I was raped, but maybe I wasn't. So all of that pre-contemplation stuff if we can invite somebody into our services and our programs and get them into a peer-based environment, a group environment, it allows them to begin to move through these journeys and also stay. So there's a lot of value, and I think we underestimate the value of actually the transtheoretical models of changes and mapping them and understanding them. So we use this tool. This is the tool I was telling about, Scott Miller's tool. It's a feedback-informed treatment model. This tool by Scott Miller has been proven that when we use it, that it says that the majority of the effectiveness of whether or not a group succeeds or not is about the alliance in the group, right? Not the alliance to the therapist running the group or the alliance to the peer-based person running the group, but the alliance of the group to each other. And so this tool measures both how the individual is doing as well as the alliance to the group, and allows you to attend week by week if the alliance is weak or if the alliance is strong. And so this tool, I think, has allowed us to help clients to engage more, or to engage longer, or to understand why clients stop engaging, and to be able to sometimes address the external factors in their life that are stopping them from being able to engage. We love this tool. And so I would strongly recommend looking into it. And then the last thing I want to talk about is psychoeducation. We know that psychoeducation and coercive control is really important because it's a client-centered approach. It's the use of educational strategies to support positive mental health outcomes. Julie Jenkinson talks a lot about not just psychoeducation, but relational theory as well as part of psychoeducational. But it's a proven method, and we know that it's a proven method. But we know that psychoeducation alone is not enough. So what is my conclusion? Peer-based groups are evidence-based in approaching coercive control. There are multiple complementary approaches and tools that can be integrated. My experience, Jess's experience, that peer-led groups with clinical support. So our groups are all led by former survivors of either domestic abuse, sexual exploitation, coercive control, whatever that looks like. But there's always a clinician behind them that has trained. So they have to go through 4 full days of training and then 6 weeks of sitting in as a co-facilitator in a group before they can facilitate. They have a clinician that meets with them before and after every group that they run. They're given the results of those tools that I talked about. And so when I say clinical supports, I mean clinical supports. Plus CBT, transtheoretical, TTM, etological approaches, and psychoed. All of those things, they get you to a reduction in perceived stress and lowered cortisol levels. They increase safety-related empowerment and provide supportive alliances. So that's my theory about it and our theory about it. But no matter what, the decision about what to integrate and when should be flexible and integrative and focused on supporting a shared healing journey for the individuals who are in the group. So this is how you can get in touch with me or say Jess. There's lots of references at the end. I'm gonna go back, but just so you know, yeah. But just so you know, if you want the references, they're all there.